Okay, Mike said to just give a minute or two for people to trickle in after lunch, but thank you everybody for coming to my session. Hopefully you're in the right place around unbundling the core. So today I hope to take you on a journey, looking first how the core banking system can be unbundled, and then the innovation that can happen on top around it, and really helping to bring that life through several case studies of how this unbundling is brought to bear. So just a little bit about myself. First off, my name's Ed. I oversee the Mifos Initiative. I'll talk a little bit more about Mifos, but I'm also a part of the project management committee for Apache Fineract, which Mifos donated into Apache, which is the core banking platform I'll be talking about. And then I also sit on the Baseflow team as well. And here are just some images of the animals I referenced on the previous slide. I have a wolf dog, huskies, and some goats. So this is what keeps me busy in my spare time when not helping to steward our open source community. So just a little bit about Mifos. First off, we're a global 501c3 fintech nonprofit. Our mission is to help bring financial services to the 3 billion underbanked. So it's unique that we have our roots in microfinance, but now our core banking platform is being adopted for a wide variety of use cases worldwide. And so key parts of our vision and philosophy are to commoditize that core infrastructure and then to create a virtuous cycle of a global community contributing on top of that open core. And we do that by helping to guide an ecosystem of companies building solutions around the core banking platform. And so to date, I think this number is somewhat conservative, but there are more than 500 organizations worldwide using our APIs in some form or fashion, and they're reaching more than 60 million clients. So today what I'm hoping to cover is to initially just really define what those boundaries are of the core, look beyond it, how you can bundle different solutions around it, and then I'll go through a series of real-life case studies to practically demonstrate how different companies in our ecosystem built on top of an open core, as well as some practical advice how you can do that yourself. So first off, let's just define what a core banking system is. I just put some screenshots here around how Gartner defines it, how ChatGPT defines it, how FinTech Future defines it. But essentially, the core is that back office system of record to manage those accounts. They could be deposit accounts, credit accounts, and then being able to do all the daily transactions and updating those accounts via the ledger, and then generating the necessary reports and outputs. So that's like a basic, simple definition. And then wanted to talk a little bit around how the evolution of the core is happening right now. There was a recent talk, I think, this gentleman from Galileo gave, helping to define some parameters around the modern next generation core. And so first off, there's this notion that the core is slimming. So really it's that system of record for maintaining these customer accounts, doing those day-to-day postings of your debits and credits to the ledger, and then the servicing of those accounts. And this narrower definition of the core, really fits and aligns with this notion of unbundling, where you don't have like a massive monolithic system where you're relying upon one vendor, but you can stitch together various solutions and components to have an end-to-end offering. And that's what we're going to cover today. And this is a nice quote that he had here, looking at that evolution. I think Angela Strange on previous Moov DevCons has also highlighted this evolution. So looking at how we're moving from mainframes to these cloud-based systems. And then I myself only became familiar with the term mock architecture very recently, but our Fineract architecture and these next generation cores align well quite with this. And so it's microservices based, being able to develop and scale these different components individually. It's API first, providing an accessible API to allow other systems to easily integrate. It's also cloud native. Our system's multi-tenant, easy to run and scale in the cloud. And then lastly, it's headless to allow those innovators and ecosystem to focus on building applications and whatever user experience on top of the backend core. And so a couple months back, there was a discussion on LinkedIn that Wade commented on, where I think Brad Smith of Cornerstone Advisors was introducing this term of like the Frankencore to help represent and describe the new breed of systems of components of mashed up cores, that he termed Frankencore. And this was building off of the term zombie core from, I think, his colleague Steve Wildman, helping to represent that living dead system that's just there, with rotting flesh of customizations and additional middleware layers brought on to keep it living and keep it around. And today I want to introduce a new term called the Wolverine core, which helps to describe these modern next generation cores that are open source, where they have the superpowers of Wolverine, where they're self-healing, they're continually evolving, they're long life, and they're delaying aging, they're very agile. And so that's where we enter Mifos and Fineract, where this is an open source core banking platform that exemplifies those aspects of the mock architecture, as well as this Wolverine core, where we're creating that virtuous cycle where we have a global community that's helping to continually maintain the software, it's helping to continually evolve it, it's easy to adapt, and it's agile. And that's what we're going to focus on a bit today. So. And then just have one other visual here to help distinguish where Fineract sits on its own. This is just like a small diagram looking at cost effectiveness as well as composability and control, and put Fineract sort of in a class of its own, given its open source, given the community nature, where it's easy to adapt, it's lower cost, it's accessible, and we've got that global community helping to maintain it. And then before I get to actually defining the core system itself, just wanted to take a brief look at the evolution of Fineract to date. So as I stated earlier, we're kind of unique where we had our roots in microfinance and financial inclusion. So our goal is to bring financial services to the base of the pyramid, but we've realized over time that really is just the tip of the pyramid for us. So we still have widespread need to digitize those microfinance institutions and SACCOs who are going that last mile. But we've seen widespread adoption among the governments, primarily around this movement around digital public goods and digital public infrastructure for flows like G2P, so government-to-person payments, as well as person-to-government payments, and also just providing widespread access to accounts in the cloud. And then we've also seen widespread adoption from banks and neobanks. It might be progressive modernization of the system, or it might be having a greenfield implementation for a new set of use cases. But we've seen both legacy banks as well as digital banks adopt the core. And then where we've seen a lot of organic adoption, primarily around lending institutions, has been around fintech and embedded finance, where they've taken our open source APIs and the strength of the ledger and been using it for a number of use cases. This could be direct to consumer fintechs, infrastructure as a service, telcos, platfins, et cetera. And then this slide here, helps to demonstrate just a small slice of the adoption we've seen organically from various companies, primarily lending ones that have focused on, building out their solution using our open core. So now that we've set the stage a little bit looking at Mifos and the evolution of Fineract, I want to define some of the rules in the playbook for success. So first off, hopefully the remaining portion of my talk will be, valuable from a practical perspective for those fintechs or financial institutions who might be, migrating or modernizing their core or building a new end-to-end solution. So first off, just want to, understand what those boundaries of the core and how they're slimming. And then really the importance of deeply understanding your requirements and knowing where your core strengths and capabilities are and where you have those areas in which to differentiate. And then this will help to inform that approach that you should take around how you design and architect your solution. And then hopefully through the practical case studies I'll share, you can see in real world examples how this has been brought to bear. And so I went to Penn for my undergrad, so I'm going to use some metaphors and imagery and visuals related to track and field. So this is, I think, one of the first running of the Penn relays at Franklin Field. So I wanted to use Franklin Field to help establish, sort of the boundaries of what that core is, and then there'll be some other metaphors related to track. And I think it's timely given the Olympics right now. And so I'll come back to this visual a little bit later. It's a bit of an eye chart, but right now this is the blue components in the middle are sort of those common open core components, and then the pink components around the periphery represent more of those boundaries where there's differentiation, innovation, and where you can build or integrate additional solutions to create that end-to-end solution. And so here's just a little bit closer look of these blue components once again. These are those areas where our expectation is the open source community will collaborate in an upstream manner to collectively maintain these. And so this is that area of co-opetition. And then this is the area where fintechs, financial institutions, et cetera, can differentiate and innovate by either building new modules, building new integrations, like extending with other systems and whatnot. And so I'll spend the next few minutes of the presentation talking about the core and talking about beyond the core, and then we'll get to the case studies. And then there's one last eye chart before we move on. So as I'm defining the core, I'm going to probably go over these pretty quickly. But first off, just want to define some of those basic capabilities, and then at a high level, how well Fineract meets them. So first off, just going back to that initial definition, the core should be able to handle these key capabilities around managing the customer, creating your various financial products, doing that transaction processing, actually servicing the portfolio and those accounts, and then having that core ledger to track the debits and credits, having the proper internal controls, and then being able to generate the necessary reports and output, and then having good points of integration and accessibility. So first off, around customer management, essentially the core, especially in the slimming notion of it, you should be able to define that customer record, however thin it might be, and then uniquely identify the customer and associate the various data with that. And then within Fineract, you can do that. And we have a concept of data tables where you can attach additional forms of data, but I'll talk more around where there's points of innovation around the customer record itself. And then next up is really just the core capability around creating those various products, whether they're loans, deposits, share accounts, et cetera. And this is where Fineract and Mifos really shine, where there's a strong breadth of configuration and adaptability around the different lending products that are supported and how well you should configure them. But I think any core system should allow this innovation without having to do customizations or modification of the code. And our modules in Fineract are mature in terms of functionality, but varying degrees of scalability, which I'll touch on in some of the case studies. And then next up is more just around that day-to-day transaction processing. So on the lending side, being able to handle a wide variety of repayment schedules, interest calculations, delinquency measurements, savings, being able to track dormant accounts. And then even though, these systems operate in real time, there still are close of business processes and end-of-day jobs that need to be run, but being able to run these efficiently without interrupting those day-to-day interactions. And then around servicing the accounts, so being able to have visibility into your delinquent portfolio, being able to take measures around that to help with collections. And then most importantly, having a strong ledger in place, being able to have that full chart of accounts, being able to make sure the postings from each financial transaction are automatically mapped to your ledger. And then another key point, especially in this notion of the modern next generation core, is the ease of integration and accessibility. So having that API, having the ability to generate the necessary real-time events to stream into your external systems, having webhooks and having these points of integration, and then having it be well documented. And then, in terms of just operational reports, compliance reports, management reports, being able to analyze your data, it's necessary to have some, reporting component there, or at least be able to export that data into whatever sources you're using to analyze it. And so that, is a high level at looking at the boundaries of just the core itself. And I wanted to focus a little bit beyond the core. So in this portion of the presentation, just going to once again describe that capability, and then take a look at some example solutions, whether they're proprietary, open source, and then some of the recommendations we've had for our ecosystem, but also for fintechs looking to adopt as well. So first off, I just want to categorize some of the high-level components. So there's this component around onboarding. So around customer onboarding, your KYC flows, your digital identity, your verification, but also document management, being able to upload, and then the various workflows and other process automation you need to help automate these onboarding flows. And then around loan onboarding, there's many other aspects there around loan origination, loan decisioning, being able to properly assess the credit risk of your borrowers and whatnot. And I'll dive into some of these subsequently. And then as you go beyond the core, once you actually have, an account or customer in your system of record, being able to properly engage with that customer. So this might be, customer support, it might be CRM, generating necessary notifications, having like a help desk, having a chat bot. And then also I've categorized here the digital banking and having an omni-channel approach, being able to connect into the channels where you need to meet your customers. So often for our emerging markets, this might be USSD or SMS, but here in like the US and more developed markets, mobile banking apps like WhatsApp, chatbots, and what have you not. And then another key area is just money movement. So this is being able to connect into whatever the payment rails are in your ecosystem. So in our space where we're working, often it's mobile money, but there's emerging systems like Mojaloop for instant inclusive payment systems. For markets here, like in the US, it might be ACH, FedNow, RTP in Europe, SEPA, et cetera. But the core, or at least one of like the layers, should be able to help orchestrate and enable these flows. And then within our ecosystem, we have another open source project called the Payment Hub, which helps to enable the movement of these monies and connect into the various payment rails. And then lastly, not the least important category, but bucketing a number of other aspects, your security, your compliance, your fraud detection, and that integration layer as well. So I'm going to spend a few more minutes looking at these components, and then the majority of the presentation will be on some of the case studies. So just around customer management, it's important to be able to track that full life cycle of the customer and have that 360-degree view. And so within our community, we've seen sort of a tension between sometimes small institutions want to have more of these capabilities in the core, and then larger ones, want to separate and externalize that. So we're trying to balance that within our ecosystem. And so you'll see on some of our case studies, some people have built a separate customer module, but essentially the core still should have that record for the customer to uniquely identify them. And then another key component in the customer onboarding is more around this KYC automation. So the KYC and KYB processes are quite unique and different in each region, but there are various frameworks or automation tools in which to help automate these flows and connect into the various identity sources or databases that are needed for onboarding. So I've listed a few on the screen, and we've been exploring integration with Ballerine, an open source framework for some of this within our community. And then this is also very region and country specific, but just being able to connect into that digital identity and verify and screen against that. And so, we're eager to explore collaborations and partnerships with any of these digital identity providers here, because our goal is to really build out that ecosystem of modules and integrations that can be available to our widespread community. And then around loan origination, this is an area where we don't cover a lot in the core. Some core systems do more so, but helping to automate these flows and be able to connect in the various processes and tools necessary to prospect your potential customers and bring the necessary tools. And then this next category around loan decisioning and credit scoring is where we see a lot of innovation across our community, where this is quite region specific as well, whether it's traditional credit scoring or it's more alternative credit scoring metrics, but there's a lot of potential here to really help address some of the credit gap. I think Matt in his presentation yesterday noted that for SMEs there's a $5 trillion credit gap, and a lot of that boils down to being able to do the proper risk assessment on the potential borrowers. So that's an area where we see a lot of space for competition and innovation. And then next up is around payment orchestration. So as I stated earlier, being able to have an adaptable orchestration layer to connect into whatever that payment rail is that's widespread and prevalent in your country or region. So I mentioned before, for us, often that's like a mobile money API. You might have heard of like M-Pesa from Safaricom in Kenya. And then, we're looking at, or some of our entities that have worked with us have integrated with SEPA. We're exploring FedNow integration. Our partners have integrated with SPAY in Mexico, PIX in Brazil. But we see the core as being that management for the store of value, and then the orchestration layer helping to facilitate that movement of value. And the tool that we use is our payment hub, and we use ZB as the workflow engine to orchestrate those flows. And so this is a little bit building on the last slide, but this is going to be, once again, very region specific, but your core should be able to integrate in with whatever the respective payment rails are in your given jurisdiction. And so these can be real time, these can be batch based, but being able to have that flexibility to connect in and orchestrate those various flows. And then this isn't something that's come up with many of our use cases from our emerging market, but definitely in more developed markets where cards are prevalent, being able to handle these processes. And this is typically where our fintechs or financial institutions, they're not going to build something on their own. They're not going to have it within the core, but they'll integrate with third parties. And then around customer support, this is an area where within our open source platform, we could add more capabilities around CRM and help desk once again, but I think this is also another area where fintechs, neobanks, et cetera, can really differentiate, where they can build out like a very robust customer experience and help the customer through all the pain points they might have in their journey of using your financial services. And then omni-channel or that digital banking is really key. So from the core, exposing and having secure APIs to connect into those channels. And then within our community, we offer some reference mobile banking, mobile wallet, or PISP and third-party initiation apps. But I think this is also, once again, one of those areas where we see the ecosystem having that be that spot where they can differentiate, they can build their unique customer experience. But once again, the core should be able to connect into that in an easy, flexible manner. And then lastly, around financial crimes compliance, Soups just gave a good talk on fraud detection and looking at all the different fraud patterns. And there's an open source project called Tazama, which emerged from the Gates Foundation, was helping to define topologies and have a framework for fraud detection. But once again, this is an area where, especially as more and more entities are connecting into instant and real-time payment systems, it's key to partner and integrate with the best-in-breed solutions. So that was a quick run-through of the core itself and then those ancillary solutions around the core. And so now, before we dive into the case studies, just wanted to give a small bit of a training plan for success. And so building an end-to-end solution is both like a marathon and a sprint. And so it's a marathon in terms of it's, a long process. It's gradual. You need to build up. You really need to know and understand your requirements, but know your strengths and know and understand yourself. And Mifos and Fineract, being open source, continually evolving, it can be there for that long journey. And then building an end-to-end solution is also a sprint where you have to really be nimble, you have to be reactive, you have to be able to stay ahead of the competition, you have to be able to respond to your customer needs. And then next generation cores, or these Wolverine cores that are open source, can position you to do that by having them have the source code freely available, having the API accessible, and being able to innovate in an agile manner. And so that's why, the building of an end-to-end solution is both a marathon and a sprint, and hopefully the case studies will help to bring that to life. So as I look at these case studies, I'm going to go through various case studies from around the globe. We're going to start off, looking at US, Western and Eastern Europe. We'll travel on to South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and conclude in Latin America. And the case studies will cover a wide variety of use cases, a wide variety of entities, a wide variety of scale. So hopefully it'll be a valuable, and practical demonstration of how various real-world companies, whether it's fintechs, public sector, institutions, banks, et cetera, have been able to get to market quickly with a solution on top of an open core. So now that we've started the race, let's begin. So the first case study is going to be looking at a buy now, pay later lending case at scale. So we've codenamed this project the Pepper Soup project, and I'll talk more about some of the key benefits of it. But I think what's unique about this case study is the high degree of scale we're able to achieve. So a software that is originally designed for microfinance institutions has been able to scale up to support opening hundreds of millions of loan accounts in a year. And then I think another key aspect is the upstream contribution that went back into the open core, which is a key principle and philosophy we want all adopters to take. And then lastly, the execution and delivery of the project, where we were able to deliver everything upstream, but the customer in parallel was able to integrate that into their downstream systems and do that in a rapid manner without any disruption to their operations. And so here on the screen, the points I wanted to highlight was, first off, the main pain point that led to this project. So the pain point was that the customer in their highest growth market, they were really constrained from their growth around their short-term buy now, pay later portfolio from their existing legacy system, Temenos. So it was very high cost, they had poor performance, and they lacked the control that they needed. And so the solution was one of their architects, he just reached out to me via email, and then within a month, we had started a 2 to 3 month POC to demonstrate that we as the open source project and our team of developers could meet the scalability, the requirements that they had. So these were pretty high, and we were challenged in which to do this, but being able to support opening 1,000 loans per second, being able to support 8,000 read operations per second, and close the business jobs for 2 million loans under a half hour at the end of the day. So fortunately, we were able to demonstrate those measurements during the POC, and then we moved into a year-long build-out and rollout project, and then in mid-2023, rolled out the first product for that one market on top of the new system of record. And then since then, we've also been migrating 6 other products, or two other products over for 6 different markets, and now we're also working on migrating over some longer-term installment loans. And some of the key benefits I want to call out were, first off, the license savings. So they've estimated for just these 2 short-term products over the course of 5 years, they'll be saving $230 million in licensing costs. And then secondly, just in terms of the performance of our APIs, for that Create Loan API, it performed 5 times as well as the Temenos API, and that actually led to a 2% increase in the take rate when a consumer was deciding whether or not to convert a purchase to a buy now, pay later loan. And then lastly, this will be demonstrated in the next slide, the team was very happy in just the speed and execution in which we were able to deliver the requirements. So we were able to, by an order of magnitude, shave the time in which we were able to build out the system and go live. And so fingers crossed, we'll continue that, same speed of rollout, but we've been able to ramp up very rapidly in migrating from their existing system of record to the new one built on open source in a very efficient manner. And so here I have a number of the different components that we helped build out on top of the core. And I'll touch on these with the visual going back to that chart, looking at the boundaries itself. But just at a high level, some of the components that we extended. So first off, there were some additional functional capabilities we needed to add in to support buy now, pay later loans. So most of our lending was more around installment loans for microfinance or other purposes. So we had to add in the concept of a down payment. And then we also had to make the payment application logic fully configurable. So that's the order in which a payment gets applied to principal, interest, fees, and charges. And then there were a number of other functional enhancements, but all of this went back into the upstream. And at more of a technical and non-functional level, to achieve the scalability required, we introduced support for Postgres. Previously it was MariaDB and MySQL. Then we added in Eclipse Link support, and then also added in a new Spring Batch module to enable parallelized batch job processing such that inline transactions could occur without interrupting the day-to-day operations. And then the other big major enhancement was being able to introduce Kafka and a more reliable event framework to generate the necessary business events that the customer required. And then lastly, we also cleanly separated how the read, write, and batch APIs were working such that there could be containers and instances just to scale up the read operations or scale up the write operations. And then in parallel, the customer focused on integrating these components into their downstream solutions. And so this is just a visualization of how the customer utilized these core components. Like the key aspect was utilizing the lending module, but then as I noted earlier, building out that new batch processing module, which we use Spring Batch for, and then the reliable event framework. And it was key for this event framework to be able to stream all the necessary data into the end user facing applications so they could have real-time visibility into the performance of their BNPL loan. And then the batch processing was also key because the customer had to, at end of day, within 5 hours, generate all the necessary compliance reports for all of the loans for that day. And they were able to do that because our new batch module was able to, I think, perform 60% more effectively. And then this just helps to represent a number of the different components that they already had in their existing systems, or they built, or we had to integrate with. So once again, I want to iterate that a key part of the success of this case study was just the ability for our team to develop and deliver all the enhancements to the open source into the latest upstream code base. So there was no delay or gap in syncing that. All of those benefits went back to the open source community. And then at the same time, the customer was able to integrate our system through our APIs into their various downstream systems, consume all the various real-time events. So overall, I just think this was a great case study to highlight the value of contributing back into upstream, but the ease in which they were able to take our APIs, integrate it into a highly performant system, operating at planet scale. And they've been very pleased with the flexibility and control they've had, and also the ability to have 24/7 operations with no downtime. And then now, we're working on those longer term installment loans, and the only major difference here is we've had to extend upon the interest-bearing support, which was an area where we're continuing to refactor the loan module to meet the unique requirements they have there. So next up, I want to take you to Eastern Europe and Hungary. And so this is going to be looking at the digital transformation of a greenfield institution, focused on providing current accounts to SMEs within Hungary. And so I think what's unique about this case study is the partner, like Baseflow, they implemented and extended a number of the core modules within Fineract, but also built a number of proprietary components to provide that end-to-end solution for the customer. And so Binx is the fintech, and they're a visionary fintech that was looking to really modernize the banking services to SMEs. They have a separate company that's doing all the invoicing for the SMEs, and now they issue these e-money accounts to the SMEs. And most of the flows in Hungary were very manual, time-consuming, and then this led to great inefficiencies and high transaction costs. And so Binx really wanted to turn this model on the head, but they couldn't do that if they were working with a traditional large, core banking provider, or working with a small fintech. So working with Baseflow, although it was a startup, was a good mix in the middle. So they were able to have the stability of an existing open source core system, but the agility of a startup to respond and build a solution that really, met the direct needs. And so some of the key benefits I want to highlight from this case study is by building on top of an open core and then building these specific modules for their use cases, Binx was able to get to market relatively quickly, much more quickly than if they had built a system from scratch. And then by digitizing their onboarding flows, they were really able to lower the transaction costs and have a zero-fee banking offering to SMEs, which helps to differentiate them in the market. And then they've also been able to streamline their processes and efficiencies. And so this is just some screenshots of some of the customer-facing apps they've built and some of the digital onboarding flows that they were able to build out by leveraging our APIs. And then I'll skip over this, but it's just a quote from their CEO. But I think the key thing he was highlighting was a very close relationship between the Baseflow team and theirs in executing on the specific requirements they had and being able to identify what was a core component and what was a unique module that was for Baseflow and also what was a unique module for Binks as well. And so here's a small breakdown of some of those components. So one of the major enhancements to the core was the current account in Mifos and Fineract needed to be scaled up. The current account or the savings account in Mifos originally was there as a passbook savings account for microfinance institutions. So it didn't have that scalability that was necessary for a high volume actual wallet transactional account. And so that was one of the enhancements. And then for this project as well, the customer built a separate module for customers called Customer 360. And this was key because there were a number of, so given these were SMEs, there's multiple users at each SME. And this allowed them to define various personas for each user. So you could have, one user could have multiple personas to do different operations for the SME. And then there was also the need to extend the transactional data that was stored in Fineract. So they used the data tables module to provide all the fields that were necessary for ISO 222 integration. And then lastly, it was key just to use and maintain the Fineract ledger for those underlying accounts. And then on the ancillary components, like I'll showcase these on the next slide, but there were a number of unique modules that were built. So there were these digital onboarding flows that were needed to be built, including document management, being able to e-sign the various documents and do that identity verification that you saw earlier. The partner Baseflow also had to build a notifications framework, and this was deeply tied into that Customer 360 module and being able to send the notifications to various personas and users. Likewise, there was output management to generate all the necessary statements online in PDF form. And then another key area was Baseflow worked on building out that secure backend for the front end to enable that customer-facing app that you saw earlier. And then lastly, using the payment hub that was there to put in place the SEPA integrations both for batch and instant payments based on the ISO 222 standards. And so I think what's sort of unique in this case is that the implementation didn't really use that much of the core itself. So it really was a true unbundling where at the end of the day, it was just the underlying ledger, a very thin customer record, and the transactional account that was utilized. And then a lot of the innovation, sat around the edge. So building that new Customer 360 module, integrating with ForgeRock for that authentication, authorization, using the payment hub to connect into the batch-based and instant payment systems. But that's the Binks case study. And then next up, going to travel quite a bit further. We're going to go all the way to India and South Asia, and then look at a case study with Apache Finance. And so this is actually, sort of more around that core initial market focus we had around microfinance and financial inclusion. And so Apache actually started using Mifos more than, a decade ago when they were only reaching customers in the thousands, but now they've scaled to over 1 million customers. And the main pain point they were aiming to achieve by digitizing their operations was to really, grow beyond the operational efficiencies they had, being able to replace their cash-based collection system and help to eliminate some of the risk of fraud that was there. And so they worked with one of our local implementation providers, Finflux, who got acquired by M2P Fintech, a larger fintech. And Finflux already had like an existing cloud-based SaaS solution that they'd built on the open source APIs, but they continued to extend it with different modules for Apache. And I think the key sort of takeaway here is just by being able to leverage that API-first architecture of our core, they were able to harness more of the capabilities of the India stack. So I think many of you have probably heard of Aadhaar, the UPI, and the various APIs that India makes available. And so by having our API-first architecture and that conducive enabling environment in India, we're really able to have full cashless operations. And then leveraging like the common core banking infrastructure also enabled them to be able to innovate. So the next well, I'll have a screenshot later on, but there's some neat innovation around how they were able to optimize the movements of their field officers. And then in terms of the actual results and impact, they're able to grow their portfolio from only $1 million to $122 million. And in general, they've become a leader and innovator in financial services for the base of the pyramid in India. And so looking at the various components that were utilized, once again, I think the key thing to distinguish is within India, there are all those components around identity, payments, eKYC, like account aggregation or third-party initiation. So all those APIs were able to be utilized easily. And then they did continue to use fairly heavily the core modules within Fineract and Mifos itself. As you can see, most of the boxes on this screen are noted in green. I think the other key aspect too around the FinFlux solution is they built a lot of components around origination and decisioning that are lacking in Mifos and Fineract, which more handles the loan management. And then once again, here's that visualization of how FinFlux was able to utilize the India stack to help deliver this innovation for the Digamber finance. And that neat piece of innovation I wanted to highlight was that for part of their, so with microfinance, if you're not familiar, that involves the field officers actually going out into the field to the various group and center meetings to meet with the clients. And so using operations research algorithms in their field mobility app, they were able to optimize the route of the field officers. And I was surprised by this metric here, but they said it saves 20,000 kilometers each day of their field officers traveling to their clients and borrowers. So that's neat to show that by building on an open core and having more time to think about and differentiate and have innovation, they're able to build unique innovation like that. And this is just a quote from their CEO. And then gonna head to sub-Saharan Africa now. And so this next case study is looking at a microfinance bank, which became more of a digital-first bank in Nigeria. And so sub-Saharan Africa is where we do have widespread adoption around microfinance institutions, SACCOs, but now also, telcos and various fintechs. But this is going to focus on VBank in Nigeria and working with their local partner, or their global partner, Fitter, to build a custom solution. And so VBank was already using a SaaS solution, but it was quite rigid, and they lacked the flexibility and control they needed to really shape their own IT destiny. And so that's why they decided to work with Fitter, who could extend an open source system, which would allow them that access to the source code and the control they needed to innovate over time. And so the key enhancements they worked on were similar to what Binx did. They had to separately, enhance the current account module as well. And I think this is a good example where if either of these partners had contributed that innovation back into the core, this would have been a reduced effort on each part. So that's what our aim is, to reduce that duplicative investment, as we don't, for core modules like the current account, we don't believe it makes sense for everybody to go introduce those scalability enhancements. So I think this really helps to bring the important of that virtuous cycle and aiming to contribute back. But then the other areas where they innovated was building out a more advanced reporting module and then being able to connect into the various channels to meet the consumer where they were. And in terms of the benefit, they're now able to innovate without any limits, without any dependence on a third-party vendor. They've also been able to open up new revenue sources by leveraging the open banking APIs in Nigeria. And then lastly, now they have a platform in which they can grow and expand to other countries throughout Africa for a Pan-African strategy. And then this quote here helps to orchestrate and demonstrate just that flexibility and the ability to control their business model based on having control of their own IT destiny. And so I've touched on most of these, but once again, some of the key enhancements were extending that current account, building the new reporting module, but then leveraging the APIs to build those customer-facing digital apps where the customers are. So in this case, in Africa, it was WhatsApp, USSD, and a mobile banking app. And then once again, here's that visual looking at which components they used. Here, it's a rather thin usage again, looking at the current account module. And then I'm going to show just a few of the components once again here. So a key focus here was utilizing the APIs, the API gateway to enable those open banking connections and also those customer-facing connections. And then last up, I want to conclude with a couple quick case studies in Latin America. So these were led by our local partner there, Fintechando. And so the first is going to be a public sector case study looking at deployment of this CB solution with a government institution, Infotech, to provide widespread financial inclusion across Mexico. And so the main pain point here was the government wanted to be able to directly provide a solution to help meet the broader financial inclusion needs of the underbanked across Mexico, as the private sector weren't adequately meeting those. So a lot of this centered around the time of COVID, being able to distribute some payments there, but then they also wanted to modernize some of the financial inclusion programs that they had. So our local partner worked closely with Infotech, which is an internal government software and research agency, and then they built out an enterprise system they call CB, which is being deployed at 2 of the national institutions there. And I think this is a good example of that collaboration that can occur with the public sector, and it's a good example of how open source core banking can be at the foundation of digital public infrastructure. And this is just a couple of the growth projections they have for the use cases they're working on. Right now, only the scenario 1 is in production, but that's on financial inclusion lending at scale. But they've been able to digitize the onboarding and screening of SMEs and provide loans to them, and then also digitize the repayments and collection of those loans. And then the second scenario, it's not fully in production right now, but there are a widespread number of integrations with the electoral systems, the SPAY, real-time payment systems, and the various points of integration that were necessary for an end-to-end solution. And this was another area where if this solution goes live, it's also replacing Temenos as the legacy solution too. And this is just looking at that visual here, seeing the various components that were utilized. I think what's sort of unique about one of these implementations is the partner utilized both our current generation of the core, and we had a next generation that we've actually deprecated, but they used some modules from each of those to provide a scalable loan account module and then a scalable current account module. And then here's just looking at the lending use case. So the previous use case was more around the full end-to-end bank with current accounts, and this one is more just on lending. And so the last case study I want to highlight is once again in Latin America. So this is with the same partner, Fintechs. So they utilize both Mifos and Fineract as well as our payment hub to allow this fintech fast cash to connect into the PIX real-time payment system. And so really the pain point here was just that this institution, fast cash, needed the ability to connect into the real-time payment system and generate all their necessary compliance reports and be able to do this at scale. So our partner extended our payment hub, deployed it on highly scalable technology to meet the transaction per second requirements, and then they've also been innovating in other areas to help the fintech differentiate and meet the broader needs. But this highlights primarily more of like the usage of our payment hub as the orchestration layer to connect into real-time payments, but then also utilizing some of the components of the core system itself. So I've got like a few closing marks here just to summarize some of the takeaways and lessons learned from the case studies and how we've defined the core system itself. So first off, a commoditized core or this next generation core or Wolverine core, an open core, or however you want to call it, it provides a strong head start on the competition. So there is a robust amount of functionality that's there in our open source core banking system, but some of this functionality is unbalanced. So there is the need to extend some of the core modules and ideally contribute those back. But despite there being this large footprint and the large amount of functionality in the code base, it doesn't mean if you're deploying on it, you're going to be at a competitive disadvantage because everybody else in the market is using the same system. As you saw from all those pink components on the screen, there's a tremendous amount of room to differentiate and innovate. And I think that's key to help establish the notion that there's various playbooks and models for commercial success. So you could deliver a cloud-based solution on top of the open core. You could build various integrations or modules to external systems, or you could build an entire end-to-end solution using the open core. So I think just want to emphasize that point. And then once again, if you are building an end-to-end solution in all those pink areas, you really can differentiate. And then there is still room with that differentiation to collaborate. So we really want to foster that culture of collaboration and co-opetition, because creating that virtuous cycle is really the only way we're going to achieve that vision of, or the superpowers around the Wolverine core, where it has that longevity, it's self-healing, it's continually evolving. And so we're getting close to the finish line here, tossing that last baton. And then a few takeaways. These are just repeating some of the points from before, but really helping to know the boundaries of both the core as well as that playing field where you can compete and collaborate. And then recognizing that building an end-to-end solution is both this marathon and a sprint, where you have to think about the long journey, but you have to be agile and nimble in responding to needs. And then recognizing that although the open core gives you a head start, there's still a lot of room where you can build and you have to innovate yourself. And then lastly, going back to helping create that virtuous cycle, that you should be a good competitor and contributor in helping to contribute back and be a part of that upstream community. Yeah, and want to thank everybody for attending, and we're eager if any fintechs or providers want to build on top of the system. And then for some of the projects I mentioned, we also do need some developers. So if you're interested in potentially working on some of these projects, feel free to reach out to me. But thank you. So any questions? Yeah, I think we have a minute or two for questions, or feel free to come by afterwards. So yes, sir.
Next question about the product customization.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
so like the core platform and application itself is Java Spring Boot application. And then you can directly modify the source code, but we've also added in more of like a custom module layer where you can build and replace some of the standard packages with your custom module. So you can eliminate the likelihood of having to fork, or through the API, you can build like whatever component or integration or module you might need. So, yeah. Yes, sir. Yeah, the question is there a marketplace for the outside core applications? That's a good question. That's on our roadmap to both make that marketplace, but also make these contributions or these external modules more discoverable and more integratable. So we need a bit more of like a plugin style architecture, but that's on our roadmap because it's hard to discover what's out there at the moment. So, was there a question in the back? So. Yeah, there's a live demo there. The link should be working, or there's also a link where you can sign up for a trial sandbox, and then we'll provision a tenant in the cloud, and then you have like an access to a sandbox where you can, put your own data in and whatnot. So I might just take a picture of everybody here in the audience. So. Are there any more questions? So, oh yes.
Would you be able to speak to some of your short-term and long-term monetization strategies when you're using open source? Much of your product is open source.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So last week I was actually in London for a workshop called the DPG for DPI workshop. So DPG stands for Digital Public Good. And the whole purpose of that workshop was to explore sustainability strategies for open source digital public goods. And we sort of are in a unique position because some of the other systems are like identity or workflow management. But given we're focused on financial inclusion and fintech, there's a lot of economic value that gets created. So one of our goals is to maybe have an association or membership model where these fintechs or commercial companies who've gotten a lot of value out of the open source but don't contribute back would contribute back small fees. And then we're also trying to do more professional services, and then we might get more directly involved in providing hosting or SaaS instances. And then we also, as a 501c3 nonprofit, are able to take in philanthropic and donor funding as well. So, but thanks for the question. Yes, sir. Uh-huh. Yeah, that's another good question. So we work with a lot of developing or institutions in low to middle income countries. How do we keep it affordable? So the core open source software itself is available there, with no license fee. But of course, that doesn't mean it's free. But we try to build out a local ecosystem of local support providers who can provide cost-effective support. We're looking at having low-cost available SaaS versions of the software as well. And then as we work with like some of the larger customers that I've mentioned above, like hopefully by them sponsoring some of the development of like these scalability enhancements, we can subsidize and help to develop and maintain the software at a lower cost and not have that have to be passed on to the other institutions. And I guess the other point I'd make is trying to create that virtuous cycle where all of these commercial entities who get a lot of value out of the open source contribute back and help to share bug fixes, help to share new features and whatnot. So, yes, sir. Uh-huh. Yeah, I think, so the question is, on one of the slides, put some more of the traditional core vendors, and do we see ourselves as a competitor or appendage? I think in due time, we might be a competitor, or solutions that our ecosystem builds out on top of the open source to close gaps might be a competitor. But we've not, proactively, tried to move into more of these developed markets. It's been more organic adoption, but we're hoping that the ecosystem will really drive, the maturity of the platform or have the necessary compliance to be able to, compete for some of the end-to-end use cases like, perhaps supporting, credit unions in the US and whatnot. So I think over time there might be more competition, but for some of the use cases still, don't have everything that's needed end-to-end, but that's where the ecosystem could, differentiate and innovate. So. Okay, yeah, well, feel free to stop by and ask me any other questions personally in the next 10 minutes. So thank you again, everyone.